Good morning, all, and welcome to this morning's session. Again, thank you to Peter and the entire staff of the Center for World Catholicism. There are snacks, so please help yourselves. Some of you have. I think there will be more food coming later, so don't fill up on the first round.
They just don't feed us around here.
You know,
They just don't feed us. I feel very weak.
My name is Naomi Deanda, and I teach here at DePaul in a number of different departments and programs. They just hop around wherever they find need. And so it's very nice to have all of you here to talk about Alex's work. And starting this morning's session, I'm just going to ask if we go around and if everyone will introduce themselves, and then we'll lead into the session. What we're trying to do, and why this is down, is we're trying to connect with José David Rodríguez in Argentina via Skype. But technology being what it is, you never know how well it's going to work or not. So at some point you may see him pop up, and just, he can't see us, but hopefully, and the tech team is coming over, hopefully you will be able to both see and hear him. All right, so why don't we go ahead and start?
Did you want to introduce yourself?
Just introduce yourself.
Oh, okay, yeah. Timothy Matovina at the University of Notre Dame.
Eduardo Fernández at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University.
Roberto Jesuit, Boston College.
Ana Maria Pineda, Santa Clara University.
Bob Schreider. Bob Schreider, Catholic Theological Union.
Nancy Pineda, Madrid, Boston College.
Bill Kavanaugh, DePaul.
Mike Baxter, DePaul. Daniel Castillo, Notre Dame.
Dominic Polano, Lewis University.
Cecilia Gonzalez, Andrew Loyola, Marymount University.
Carmen Aguinaga, Place and Publications.
Peter Casarella, DePaul.
Rebecca Davis, Graduate Theological University.
Catherine Garcia-Rivera. I guess I should say Alex's house.
Michelle Gonzalez Maldonado, University of Miami.
Christy Ellis, DePaul University.
Thank you all again, welcome. So I'm actually going to let you just go without doing long introductions.
Okay.
So hopefully we can move in. José David will find us and we'll find him. Okay.
Well, I'll echo the thanks to everyone at DePaul for the wonderful hospitality, and to Catherine for being with us, for many wonderful meals and conversations at your home over the years, to Alejandro for all the long walks we had in Texas, in Berkeley, and wherever else we worked. I also want to thank Carmen Aguinaga, who joined us this morning. The main sources I'm going to use for my little comments this morning are Alex's sort of popular articles in U.S. Catholic and El Momento Católico. Actually, with Carmen's help, and this is what I want to thank her for, among other things, she helped me to collect them all. So this is something I know Peter's thinking about, a publication possibly out of this. I think going back over these articles is a great way to look at Alex kind of from another lens. We had a wonderful set of presentations last night about Alex's books and his major publications. I think some of his finest stuff is in these little articles. You might not know who Carmen is. Some of you who are just joining us, almost 90% of Alex's popular, grassroots ministerial publications were with Colloquium publications. So Carmen was basically his editor for almost every popular thing he wrote, and helped to take great ideas and make them accessible, and was a great partner. Alex often spoke fondly of her. So.
I did it the first couple of times, then he didn't need any more editing.
He took off.
Yeah.
Well, felicidades y gracias for all you have done. So, as you know, those of you who know me, my favorite branch of theology is chistología. So I've got to start out. Alex was a great person to tell jokes to, because if he didn't like it, he'd tell you that's not very funny. Or you get a laugh. So you kind of, it's a good way you're going to try that joke out. So I want to tell this joke in honor of Alex, because I think this is something he would like. I can't remember if I ever told her something. But the story goes like this. This guy's walking down the street, and out of the ground is coming this beautiful cathedral. And workers are running everywhere working on this, what's going to be a beautiful cathedral. So he walks up to one fellow who's there, and he's working with stained glass, and he's an artisan, and very meticulously working with the stained glass and putting all these images in it. And he says, what are you doing? What's your job? He said, well, I'm a glass imprinter, and I have to make sure these things are symmetrical because they're going to be on opposite sides of the cathedral. So I'm making glass and glass images. He says, oh, okay, very good. And the next guy says, well, what are you? He says, well, I'm an artisan of brick, so I'm laying the brick that's going to be part of this passageway that's an entranceway over here. And I'm a bricklayer, a master bricklayer. And then he sees this guy who has the most menial, back-breaking job on the entire work plan. And he's hauling broken bricks in a wheelbarrow and taking them to the end of the construction site. Then he's got to take this big old hammer and beat them into dust so they can reground them and try to make correct bricks the next day. And sweat's coming off his brow, and he said, you, what are you doing? What's your job? He said, me? I'm building a cathedral. That's what I always love. And reading over these the last weeks, Alex's stories were always stories about the unexpected hero, inevitably. Of course, the most famous one is San Martin and the animals was referred to last night. He repeats that over and over again in these articles. He comes back to that and many others. But stories that help us to see not just the big story and the little story, but the big person in the little person. The dignity of simple, everyday activities and how they are part of something larger. So our task is to talk a bit about that, the big stories, little stories. Probably the thing that Alex has been quoted on the most, I would say, among our Latino colleagues, that idea that came out in his first book. So I'm going to focus on some of the things from his article. Eddie's going to focus more on sacramentality and how the big story, little story thing came into that. Well, there's one of these articles that was published with Claretian Publications. It's actually called Listen to Catholicism's Little Stories. That's a great little article that he wrote actually towards the end. And here's a line from that article. The little stories of popular devotion have a charm and profundity that somehow reveal the big story of the Church. The little stories of the faithful reveal the profound imagination of the Church. And in that imagination, the big story of our faith is visualized. As you read through, I love that quote because it really talks about what he's on about. How do we see in everyday things, popular devotions, people's stories, big stories of faith, big stories of what God has revealed to us. And actually, when you read the St. Martin book, his big story, little story, especially the big story phraseology, actually is somewhat ambiguous. I think beautifully so. But in the beginning of the book, when he uses that, he's talking about the big story that was kind of imposed on the conquered of the New World. And so it's a big story. And the little stories, the things that St. Martin did, were in a sense contesting this meta-narrative that was very domineering and justifying of conquest and so on. But then as he goes on, and more frequently in his work, in the final pages of that book, and more frequently in all the other things he wrote, the big story is not so much the meta-narrative of the oppressors, it's the meta-narrative of salvation history, indeed the meta-narrative of the cosmos, and how in the very small things that happen, we see revealed the full greatness of God, if we have but eyes to see. And that's how I remember Alex's greatness, more than anything else. In conversation with him, any little thing could incite him to a huge, huge vision of what God was doing in the world and the overall plan. So what I want to share is I pulled out of these many, many examples, 3. They're all about the incarnation. And actually reading through all the stuff he did in Claretians, the topic that happens to come up the most is Christmas. He writes about Christmas quite frequently in very different ways. So just to give some example of what this is to contribute, I want to talk about 3 different ways that Alejandro talked about Christmas and the incarnation. And I'm going to move from the kind of the more local understanding of the little story to the widest. This in a certain way complements last night in the sense that this is taking the ideas that especially Bob was teasing out and Roberto as well, and then sort of concretely how he dealt with them in telling these stories. So the first one I'm going to call, the article is called My Flight to Egypt, where he's talking about the Holy Family on the way to Egypt and his own exile as a Cuban exile. And here's what he said. He's sitting in his living room looking at a Hummel figure of Mary. And here's what he says. When I gaze at the Hummel figurine, I see not Mary sitting on a donkey, but my mother sitting on a bare wooden floor, holding tightly not the baby Jesus, but my baby sister. Unlike the silent Mary of the Hummel, this Mary, my mother, cries inconsolably. Such was the image that met my eyes when I first opened them in the land of Egypt. So talking about seeing his mother for the first time out of Cuba in Miami. And he goes on to reflect. I won't be able to summarize the whole thing, but one of the stories he tells in the article is a beautiful story about, I don't know exactly where this must have happened in Pennsylvania, because he says it was Pennsylvania Dutch, but this 5-year-old girl comes to their house where Catherine and Alejandro were having a little gathering, and the little girl was from had a very poor mother. They lived in the neighborhood, and she asked Catherine to make her a birthday cake, and so they did. They made the cake, and when the friends left, and Catherine and Alex took the cake over to the little 5-year-old girl's house, where she was with her mother, and they celebrated. And as he describes it in the article, he was a little bit surprised. The woman was polite and thanked Catherine for making the birthday cake, but there was no kind of expression of joy. There was still kind of a forlornness in her demeanor. And Alex at first was taken aback by this, but as he reflected on it more deeply, he realized that woman was teaching him what the Hummel meant. That for Mary, on the way to Egypt, for his own mother leaving Cuba, for this woman, this Pennsylvania Dutch woman he'd met, the mourning was not for what had been lost, the possessions that were lost. But this woman, what she was most worried about was not whether she had a cake or presents or not, but she was worried, Alex was surmising, that she might lose her daughter. That people knowing what poverty she was living in, how bare that home was, how absolutely kind of destitute they were, that they may come and take the daughter away. And so in a sense, she wasn't focused on what she had lost, but the one thing she had left, and really the only thing that mattered. And so he talks here about Mary clutching Christ on that donkey on the way to Egypt, not really worried about going into exile, worried about losing really the only thing that mattered. The son she carried in her arms. Okay, I can say more about that. We'll move on to the second one, leave time for Eduardo. So this one is one that I would talk about in terms of the Christmas experience, a little story that's a big story that relates to his own deep personal experience and relates something from that experience of what Mary and Joseph teach us. The second one is a little broader. It talks more about collective concerns. And this is called Jesus, Mary, and Joseph Were Illegal Immigrants. This is one of my favorites. I really like the social justice angles of everything. And Alejandro had a deep way of doing that, even though he was very focused, of course. That was part of the thing last night, how we talked about encountering the reality of evil, but still talk about beauty. I think it still is something we all need to keep working on, but here's one place where he tried to work on that. This article came out right about the time of Proposition 187 in California, and it was Alejandro's response to it theologically. I got to read a couple quotes from this because they're just too beautiful to paraphrase. Through Proposition 187, the state of California believes it can make a surgical incision into the mass of humanity living within its borders and eliminate, quote, undesirable from, quote, desirable families. The belief that such a distinction can actually be made, that such a thing as an undesirable family actually exists, such a belief carries the state of California out of the arena of political debate and into the territory of theological interpretation, a territory the state is ill-suited to travel. And he goes on and he talks about how this is, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph are the Holy Family, and how the state is actually robbed the theological richness of that concept in the way it talks about family. That's what he gets into in the article. A few more quotes just to bring home his point. A symptom of such obtrusive influence, that is the state's redefining family, which is something that is actually a holy, theological, and sacred concept and reality. A symptom of such obtrusive influence by the state on our theology of the family is the adjectives we use without critical reflection in describing families. Dysfunctional, dependent, abusive. Such adjectives, forged in the womb of social and political opinion, have created an atmosphere corroding a traditional Catholic confidence in the sacredness, even the very possibility of the family. And he concludes his final lines in this, as he appeals to his fellow Catholics, because this has been written in a Claretian Catholic publication. Californians ought to learn from undocumented immigrants what Californians themselves seem to have forgotten. There is only one worthwhile family value. We are all one family descended from a first blessing. And so he uses this whole image of as written at Christmas time to talk about, what do we mean by family, and theologically how California has taken us completely out of the theology that's the big story of family in Christian history, indeed in human history. All right, just one more. Actually, this is in a couple articles, so I'll borrow from both of them. And this is the broadest. And of course, this goes to his theme that he developed so much in his later writings: beauty, aesthetics, the cosmic vision. And so he wants to talk about the manger scene in terms of what it reveals of all of creation. This is really Alejandro at his broadest, of course, as many people are already saying and will continue to say. I love this line from one of his little reflections on this. He's talking about the nativity scene in his living room. And this is his conclusion about the nativity scene in his living room. The mysterious presence of the nativity scene is the presence of the entire universe in our living room. Now let me parse that out a little bit. This is his fuller explanation. It's not that big of a living room, as I recall. I don't think Santa could get in there. You've got to have an imagination. This is another reflection that he kind of teases that out. The visual representation of Jesus' birth in the nativity scene reveals a compact cosmology. Shepherds, in parentheses, human creatures, tending their sheep, animal creatures, hear angels, angelic creatures, singing in the heavens, while the newborn child lies atop a manger filled with hay, vegetative creatures, down on earth. Meanwhile, three magi representing the three major nations of the world, the known world, Europe, Asia, Africa, cultural creatures, follow a star, a cosmic creature. The nativity scene deliberately and self-consciously brings together a Christian cosmic universe, the visible and the invisible, in a visual mosaic of the incarnation. The hay is not only food for the animals, but also a symbol for the spiritual food of the Eucharist. And so he goes on and talks about how all the cosmos comes into a vision of peace and unity and harmony in the nativity scene. So these few little reflections, I think that some of the valuable ways we might study Alex is to begin to look at the stories he told and how he repeats stories and then deepens the meaning. That's what I've tried to do here in sort of the nativity scene at various levels of vision. But I think the greatest thing that these articles collectively reveal is just the way he noticed things. His own imagination, which, as Eddie will say now, is a deeply sacramental imagination. It was also an imagination deeply rooted in the beauty of creation and the beauty of the Word of God, the stories of our faith that he saw illuminated really in everything around him. Ultimately, I wrote out my conclusion so I can say it with some verb. Ultimately, Alejandro sees the interconnectedness of all things, the overlapping of stories that all point to one great story of the universe, a big story that is nonetheless contained in so many little stories. It's contained in those stories like living organisms are inscribed in the smallest particles of their DNA. Alejandro honed his vision of faith to unveil some of these mysteries for us. And I think one of the great ways to honor him, speaking of what it means to be a theologian, is to continue to try to unveil for others the mysteries that he opened our eyes to. Gracias.
So I've been asked to speak a little bit about the pastoral applications of some of Alex's work. And especially in terms of popular religiosity, how is it related to liturgy? And so what I did is, Alex, we worked together for about 13 years. Alex got there in 93, Kathy, is that right? I got there in 97 on the faculty. And so we worked together for about 13 years, and during these 13 years, Alex was like my big brother. He was, I would always consult him on projects and politics and all kinds of things. And Alex, I always felt like he had my back. You know, he would give me good advice. And later on, in terms of mentoring doctoral students, he was very, very helpful. So what I did to prepare my reflection here is I went back to a book that he was most influential on, and that's La Vida Sacra. Show and tell right here. I didn't go to kindergarten, so I'll spend the rest of my life doing show and tell. But what I did is I simply went to the index and I looked up Alex's name and how many references do we make to Alex's work. And there were over 17 references. So then I wrote them out and I reflected on them, and I thought, how can I do this in a way that the people that I got to know through Alex would appreciate and get a feel for, sentir, in the greatest sense. And the way I came up with was to do a little litany. A little litany of characteristics. You were describing his storytelling ability. And I could hear his stories as he was talking. And I think several ways that sometimes with Alex, he was often, for me, clearest through his stories. And so when we were writing this, it could be frustrating sometimes, because Jake Emperor, the other author, would read some of Alex's observations and he would say, Alex meant what? Now you go ask him. So we'd sit outside with a tape recorder and I'd say, Alex, Jake and I want to know, blah, blah, blah. And then Alex would think, okay, all right, okay, and he'd think, and he'd give it to us in another way. And Alex, I still don't get it, okay. All right, okay. And we'd get another one, we record it, and then I play it for Jake. And we'd both, oh. And it reminded me of something that Nancy had written in a review you did of his book, Saint Martin.
Yes.
And you said Alex has to be read in pauses. So it's like if you pour too much water on the plant, so you have to wait until it goes down. So I thought, okay. So I went back to the book and I thought, how is it that I'm struggling with this? We wrote this. But it was that sense of, it's the depth. It just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So again, and I'll get to the litanies in a minute, but one of the things that he helped us with, and Roberto, you also helped us a lot with this when we were preparing to write this book. Because it all started with me asking Jake Emperor, who had taught me sacraments, and being on Holy Hill there in Berkeley for over 20 years, Jake, what do you wish you would have known before you went to San Fernando Cathedral? And how can we pass that on in terms of celebrating sacraments in a Latino context? So what the people in the consultation told us was, don't write another how-to book. Other people have written that, like Primero Dios is a very how-to book. Show us what's behind these practices. And this is where Alex was so helpful. So that we would look at the practice but say, what's behind it? What's behind it? What's the deeper issues? And one of the elements, surprise, surprise, was cosmic sacramentality. That became a very key element, and I see that written all over his work now. Okay, so having said all of that, now a little thing about the litanies, and then I'll read you the litanies I wrote for him. One of my earliest memories is at home is praying the rosary, and on especially Saturdays and the summer. My poor mom, she would gather us around and we'd pray the rosary, and then the litanies always came. But what was so funny was my mom, there were a lot of us, So my mom had a fly swatter. So she'd go, Dios te salve María, llena eres de gracia. ¡Ta! Santa mía, Madre de Dios. ¡Ta! Padre del Consuelo, ruega por nosotros. ¡Ta! So it was a very active pedagogy. So I remember that. And I also remember benediction. So benediction, there were always the litanies, you know, and so this is call and response, and then you read the Psalms, and the Psalms are also repetitive, call and response. Bless the Lord, everything bless the Lord. And so like those of Mary, litanies have more to do with what God did in her life rather than what she herself did. So in Luke's Magnificat, she says, God who is mighty has done great things for me, holy be God's name. And that's what I felt in Alex's, looking back at this and saying, Alex is here telling us, God has done great things for me, holy be God's name, and the celebration of that. So it's got a little call and response, and no fly swatter. I'm sorry I couldn't get one. But the call and response is simply different attributes of Alex, and then in the spirit of all holy men and women, pray for us. And so the response is simply, pray for us. So I'll read the first line, I'll tell you why I chose it, and then I'll say, Alex, da-da-da-da, and the response is?
Pray for us.
Okay, all right. And you can do it with more enthusiasm if you want, it's okay. It's allowed. Se permite, se vale.
It's Argentina.
Ah, that's right. Okay, very good. So here goes the litany. Alex the contemplative. Beauty making and beholding is a phrase that Alex uses. So as in creation, when God creates the world, God then contemplates the world and sees that it was good. It reminded me of a phrase of my grandmother, El gato tiene gatitos. The cat has kittens. We come from the hand of God. So like God creates beauty, God then contemplates the beauty. And that's what Alex was doing. How he would see the beauty of various liturgies. At San Leandro, he got me to go to this parish. And he had this incredible love for the people there. And they loved him back. And that's where we had his funeral. And Alex would notice different things at prayer. And then he would point them out to me. He would notice the people praying in a certain way. So Alex the contemplative.
Pray for us.
Alex the intuitive. Alex the intuitive. He had a theology of intuition. He points out how sometimes in our theology we come across gaps as when we're trying to find the rationale behind certain practices. So here he's discussing confirmation. And we all know that poor confirmation is the sacrament in search of a theology. Alex knew that. So he says, well, let's ask people. Let's ask people, let's go to their stories. And he tells a beautiful story of Christopher. It used to be St. Christopher, now he's Mr. Christopher, because he got removed from the calendar. Anyway. But he's still there. He's still there in people's imaginations. And you'll see him in people's cars. And he has a wonderful story where, Christopher's carrying Christ and he's getting heavier and heavier and heavier. But he says, trust, just like, okay, so la carga, life gets heavier and heavier and heavier, but hold on. And hold on to Christ and keep carrying Christ. So it's another level beyond baptism. So the theology of intuition. Alex the intuitive.
Pray for us.
Alex the Guadalupano. Oh, writ large. Guadalupano, he never missed a mañanita at San Leandro's. In fact, he's the one who first got me to go there. And Alex always had funny stories of getting the mariachis, if the mariachi showed up and they had a few drinks, first of all, getting the pastor to agree to open the church at 5 in the morning. But he had great mañanita stories. But to this day, I cannot contemplate Guadalupe without hearing him describe her intimate connection with the cosmos. The sun, the moon, the stars, and she's pregnant. Alex had it down. He describes her as being a subversive mestiza, one who harmoniously brought together the Iberian and indigenous. So this subversive mestiza, on his last day on earth, December 12th, her feast, Catherine serenaded him with music in her honor. And the next morning, he went home to the Lord. I just think that is so beautiful. That Alex wanted to spend his last day of celebrating with us on December 12th. Alex the Guadalupano. Alex the people's liturgist. He invited me into his office and he asked me if I would help him plan his funeral. I can still feel the hot tears on my face that morning. And he let me cry. He was concerned about his family and he wanted to make sure that the people at St. Leander's would have the freedom to express themselves in church. Whatever the people want to do, he said, please see to it that they do it, because they've meant so much to me and they have fed my faith so much. So we ended up with a glorious participation with Aztec dancers, Ron Nakasone, the Buddhist monk friend, Catherine's Lutheran choir, and the Camaldolese monks who didn't fight with the Jesuits that morning. He insisted that I gather them all around the Eucharistic table. He said, you know, like we do with the kids at San Leandro's, and we have this big space, gather them all around the Eucharistic table, because we're all children of God. Alex, the people's liturgist.
Pray for us.
Alex, the signifier, the seer of divine mysteries. In his writings, teachings, and celebrating, he never forgot the importance of cosmic sacramentality. As Hopkins wrote so eloquently, the world is charged with God's grandeur. And Alex had that. And we see that again and again in his writings. There's a wonderful picture, and I'll pass it around. And it's a picture of him in his Panamanian hat, this great Panamanian hat. He had taste for good hats. And so Alex is there, and he's got this look, and he has this glass. So I said, Alex, that must be, and he also had taste for good wine. He said, that must be a nice glass of wine you're holding there. He said, sign of things to come in the future. But saborear, when I think of St. Ignatius, and he uses the word sentir, saborear, and it's all the senses, Alex had that. Alex the signifier, the seer of divine mysteries.
Pray for us.
Alex the embracer of cultures. He never forgot the underdog, the little people, those who embraced him as one of their own. As he told me once, I'm becoming Mexican. His good friend Socorrito saw to it that he learned all these Mexicanismos, all these Mexican expressions. At the same time, in the same picture I'm describing, he said, at the end of my earthly life, I'm becoming Cuban again. Alex, the embracer of cultures. Alex, the seeker of justice, as you just described for us, Timo. As he wrote in Wounded Innocence, the question of being made in the image of God became less and less an exercise, and more a legal and political struggle. Alex, the seeker of justice. Alex, a child of the communities of the beautiful. Alex, the child of a community, of the communities of the beautiful. Whether as a child of the universe, the trees and the stars, or of his family. A few weeks before his passing, he told me his deceased grandfather had been by to see him. Or as a brother who could enjoy having us over to their house, your house, with its magical swing in the backyard. Alex ultimately knew he belonged. He belonged. And therefore, he could welcome us into his heart. Alex, a child of the communities of the beautiful. Alex, the wise padrino. Someone who knew the power of the RCIA, especially an enculturated one. Again, he helped us with the section here. Also a padrino in the sense of accompanying us, of believing in us. So many times I was so discouraged with this. this whole thing took like 8 or 9 years. And Alex would just sit with me and say, now let's rethink, okay? This is why this is important. This is important because you have academic and pastoral theology. They're not talking to each other. You need to find a way to get them to talk to each other. And this is what you and Jake are doing here. So let's try it again. It's Alex, the wise padrino.
Pray for us.
Alex, a teacher of the Nicene Creed, someone who felt the power of light from light, creator of all that is seen and unseen. It's all throughout his writings. In fact, he wanted us to call this light from light. The publishers thought differently. Alex, teacher of the Nicene Creed.
Pray for us.
Alex, the storyteller. Someone who often reminded us of the power and wisdom of our own little, seemingly insignificant stories, which nonetheless all came together gloriously to form a dazzling mosaic in Christ. I was teaching sacraments in a summer instituto that we have, and around that time, we weren't sure in terms of Alex's health. And so we had an anointing, and Alex offered to come to my class when I spoke about anointing. And so this was all in Spanish, and Ana Maria, you were there. And so Alex came, and he spoke for about 10 minutes, and it blew our socks off. It was about his hope. He was not afraid. He had this clarity. It was just an amazing clarity. Alex, the storyteller.
Pray for us.
And finally, the last one, Alex, el cósmico. Someone who not only had a vision and trust in God for that which is to come, but someone who now intercedes for us from where he contemplates beauty itself. Alex, el cósmico.
Pray for us.
Let the church say amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, friends and colleagues, I wish you all a good and productive day. I want to thank Peter Casarella, Professor of Catholic Studies and Director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at Paul University, as well as Francis Salino, Executive Assistant of this center, for making possible this technological opportunity, allowing me to be with you in this marvelous and significant occasion from the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina. I can only laugh because if Alex would be here with us, he would be smiling because he knew that I was not very technologically pro. Well, we were friends, but here it is, the marvel of technology. It is a delight to join you in celebrating the life accomplishments of a very special human being, Dr. Alejandro García-Rivera. I knew Alex, Catherine, and the daughters for quite a while. My memories of Alex in various expressions of his calling are numerous and serve to provoke the best and most creative energies in me. His intellectual accomplishments are many, and some of them must have already been mentioned in this event. Others are surely still to be highlighted. In my brief contribution today, I want to talk about a person for whom I have a deep respect and great admiration. Alex journey toward becoming a highly treasured colleague, teacher, and scholar began early in his life, combining a profound curiosity for knowledge, a scientific approach to learning, and a deeply rooted spiritual foundation that characterized his relationship with others. My memories of the time he was completing his doctoral studies remind me of a very close friend struggling, burdened not only by the intellectual requirements he had to meet for the degree, because He could easily meet this challenge, but fraught with a struggle to come to terms with his Cuban-American identity as well as his spiritual calling. Fortunately, he was not alone in this battle. Not only his family, but friends and colleagues like Philip Hefner, Robert Schreider, Ana Maria Isacidias, Egidio Elizondo, myself, and many others who are participating in this event became his close companions, accompanying him in this stressful journey. Today, we join to celebrate his faithful and rich accomplishments. To be sure, if he were here now, his humble and unassuming character would strive to divert our focus on him to place it on someone else or some other topic. Yet, not only today, but tomorrow, and every time someone reads one of his books, articles, or hears about Alex and his life journey, the rich memories of his faithful and rich accomplishments will continue to provoke deep respect, great admiration, and the best and most creative energies. Thank you, Alex, for this legacy, and thank you all for gathering here to celebrate it.
Thank you very much, José David. I don't know if we want to do questions, or do you have more time to be with us? Because I don't think you can hear too many of us.
So just a brief time because I have a meeting in 5 minutes.
Why don't we say goodbye for now? Thank you so much for joining us. If everyone wants to say adios.
Adios.
Everyone is waving. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Love you all.
Miss you.
It's like we're back in the hot seat.
All right, so we have, we go into it. We have a little less than an hour for a discussion, sharing anything sparked your interest about these papers or last night, or anything you would like to share to begin the conversation. I think I know everyone's name, so if you just raise your hand, I'll put you on a list, because I'm sure the conversation will begin to flow after a little while. So I'll try to get your attention and then go down the list if that works. So would anyone like to begin? Reflections, thoughts?
I was struck by this idea of the whole universe being in your living room. You know, it made me think of the way, you know, all of us in the academy have to proceed in a setting which isn't conducive to that sort of integrated vision. Alex and I, talking about Catholic universities, makes the point that the question is not whether Catholic university is Catholic, but whether modern universities are universities. Because they aren't really guided by a conception of single, complicated, complex, single unified vision of reality. And I feel like in thinking of these concepts like the cosmos and of the universe, and going from the small to the comprehensive, I see in this a kind of straining toward vision of the universe. I just thought it might, well, it just occurred to me that it's a struggle for us to try to come up with intellectually count plants and animals, and spirits and souls, and how they all are one. I don't know if that requires even a response, but that's something that struck me in a kind of congenial way of looking at our challenges.
In relation to that, Mike, it really, one of the, I think, really key insights of the Garden of God, the book Garden of God, is this notion of taking the human as the paradigm for all creation rather than nature as the paradigm for the human. So that the human is not simply kind of, so that the material does not become kind of the foundation of everything, and the human person then is simply kind of a complicated animal. Right? But rather look at creation in the light of the human, and then there's a whole dimension to creation that is more than material, that is spiritual. There's a kind of consciousness even.
Yeah, and that goes along with your beautiful litany about Alex the Contemplative. A big part of his point was that the universe's being needs to be contemplated by us. That our involvement in looking at it and in the intelligibility of it and in the bringing the wholeness of it, it is key to it. It's not added on, and that I think that's a radically important concept of his. One of the things I think this speaks to what you're saying is that he always was repeating to me, we are proposing a paradigm shift, and that was like one of his litanies. This is a paradigm shift, and he knew that it was that it would meet with resistance, and I think you're alluding to that, and that it threatened a lot of boundaries. Again, because for Alex, the whole idea of the one and the many, that I was talking with Catherine about this last night, that Alex in himself, as we heard from José David, represented so many transgressions just in his very person, right? Lutheran Catholic, layman pastor, scientist, theologian, Cubano Mexicano. I mean, art critic and physicist. I mean, it was just, and I think that's key to him, is in his own embodiment. The compartments just didn't exist. They were always being, as we would say to one another, interlaced together. They were always just making the other one be more engaging and thoughtful because of the otherness, right? So, and I think that, as you were pointing out, that's a really threatening paradigm for the academy. It's very frightening. And I don't know why that is.
I was very struck by that initial comment of Timothy about not just turning to the little story and not just taking the little stories and replacing the big stories, but thinking about the relationship between big stories and little stories, and how Alec was at the same time not just giving us charming little stories, but thinking about this between. And I wondered if that related to Bob's comments about place as inhabited space. We were thinking about the relationship between the grand narratives and the new narratives, and the narratives of a people. And in relationship to Michael's question and responses, I think that in the academy it's very easy to start thinking, oh, the Latino stories are beautiful, just add them to the mix. But the question is about representation. The question is not that whether you can have a department or a course or an extra little thing here or there. The question is who in the academy is representing the people of God, and how do you negotiate that? I mean, I think the notion of inhabited places, inhabited space, is a challenge for the academy. I mean, can the academy really inhabit these spaces it claims to inhabit?
Just, as I'm hearing the conversation here, I had a few thoughts that I wonder if, I remember Rosa Maria Casa, she's a sister, carnivore sister, Mexican sister, she's a monk, and she told us once, she says that Hispanic spirituality goes from the concrete to the universal. Concrete to the universal. And I think the example she used was that of the acostar el niño, the laying of the child for the nativity scene. And so I remember seeing these little kids of a Mexican immigrant family that before they laid the child down, they had like a little shawl, and they had the child, and they would rock the child. They would pass it to the next pair and rock the child and sing these little songs. And I remember thinking at first, oh, isn't this quaint? You know, it's like they're playing dolls. And then I thought of this line. They go from the concrete to the universal, from the concrete to the spiritual. It was much deeper. They understood the incarnation in a much deeper level than I did. And so I wonder if because Alex was always talking to people in the parish, always watching their way of praying, always reflecting, and I wonder if in some ways they taught him that. The second thing was, he used to tell me, that one of the tensions was you had a parish that had maybe 4 different linguistic groups you had there. And so how do you do something like Good Friday together? And Alex taught me, he said, words divide, gestures unite. Words divide, gestures unite. So to the extent that we would keep using words or have representation, so we're going to have the 4 languages in the prayer of the faithful. We're going to do the thing 4. He says, no, let's just different groups do different things. And the gesture of the procession, the holding, the kissing, the touching will bring us all together. And it did.
I feel like somewhat of a newcomer, and I'm really grateful that everybody makes me feel welcome. I did not know Alex, and I feel like this is my introduction. I'm learning who he was after having gone through many of his texts in the last 3 months. It's just sort of a crash course. And Peter invited me to come here, I guess in the spring, and then Oleg Bischoff, I don't even know how to pronounce it. He asked me to help and do a book review, so that was my crash course. And Cecilia, you said, I'm not sure why, maybe there's a threat to the academy. There's a messiness that I'm beginning to see is actually something that suggests maybe I'm a little uptight. You know, that maybe that there's a joyfulness to his work and his approach to life, and there's what you were saying, Eddie, that you know, the gesture rather than the word allows us to come together in a unique way, and it's glorious to hear these stories. My assumption is that many of you know him very well. I'm getting that from him, so I'm learning. I'm looking forward to the rest of the day. Messiness. That's what scares me.
and he acknowledges that in the Garden of God, that is one of the shift that he makes methodologically, and he uses the word messiness. He knows there's this sort of organic, weird, you know, chaotic part to it, but I think that's why he has this amazing affinity to the arts, because the concrete becomes universal through the arts, and the chaotic bunches of brushstrokes becomes, you know, a Chagall. So I think that's where that connection really worked for him.
The entangled bank is it's not a good image to me. I just imagine getting bugs and scraped, and I don't like to garden. I kept telling my wife I don't like gardening. The tomatoes always blow up and they never ripen.
There's also one of the chapters, and I think it's a chapter in Living Beauty that Alex wrote with Tom Sergey, Bless This Mess, and he talks about liturgy being very messy, and that goes back to what you're saying too, because that's got the life in it.
Yeah, and he loved it. I mean, he had this crazy idea of using a mannequin on Good Friday. A mannequin. Because we didn't have a beautiful Cristo. No problem, no problem. They just wrapped up the mannequin. So he's like a mummy. But they're doing this procession with this mannequin who could have come from J.C. Penney. But you've got people weeping. This is so beautiful.
Yeah, why don't you probe this a little more, just go off of what you're saying. It occurs to me that maybe the way that the modern academy is arranged is actually the messy, disintegrated, cacophonous arrangement. Where we live in our own little worlds. You can be at the same university and walk past the same person every day for 10 years and just not have a clue. It's kind of dehumanizing. And I think in our minds we tend to compartmentalize ourselves and have the bureaucracies of the mind. I do this, I don't do that, and so on. It just struck me, the messiness and, it is perhaps this appreciation of the messiness is the ability and maybe the drive to understand what's just visible, what's there. And he was a scientist. And so, when you do science, you look at things and they're baffling. You understand them, and then you understand how things work. And so, actually, it's probing what's before you that you come to a greater understanding of how everything works. I thought Aquinas is, universals are always mediated through particulars. And maybe it's this interesting combination of science and art are both indicative of maybe a very natural ability to understand what's right before us, and to know that if we understand that, we begin to understand its place within everything.
Eddie, actually, I'm stuck in for just a minute and then shut Catherine. I want to thank you because what you did with us this morning in that litany was so profound in showing Conjunto as a deep level, because you're telling us these things about what Alex taught you, but you didn't just tell us, you brought us into it in a way that it showed it as well. So thank you for doing that, because it's such a different way of theologizing. I thought, wow, it's brought us in and it's early in the morning and I'm awake because I'm paying attention for when I have to respond. I'm listening for my little lines. So I'm really paying, so thank you.
Well, I think that, in terms of the compartmentalization, you're just briefly listening, but I think that that's something that theology struggles with. But I actually think the academy as a whole is becoming messier. I mean, I think in terms of interdisciplinary studies and area studies and how they're shaping, I think universities are having conversations about reconfiguring departments, reconfiguring even how you understand different colleges and universities. But I do think from the world of theology, we're actually quite behind what the rest of the academy is doing. And I struggle with that. And that's one of my problems with theology, is that it is so compartmentalized. There are so many rigid boundaries. And I don't understand what our problem is, or what the problem is. I really don't. I don't understand. And I think about it with Latino theology, and I look at what other things that are happening in Latino studies and other conversations that other racial ethnic groups have among each other within other disciplines that for some reason theologians do not have, and are so tied to these wedded categories of identity and methodology and sources. So I guess I'm agreeing and disagreeing at the same time, but and also frustrated, and I think that's why Alex's work was so challenging, because folks at JSTV didn't know what to do with it. I mean, right? I mean, And they did not know what to do with his work. And I mentioned this afternoon. They didn't know what to do with a book written by, when The Community of the Beautiful came out, a Latino theologian that didn't have Hispanic and Latino in the title. And that he was doing fundamental theology. I mean, all these things that the ways that Alex ruptured these boundaries. I mean, it was just like, what do you do with this? Because he refused to be put into the stereotype of, a Hispanic scholar that, in a very limited sense. Before I start giving my
Yeah, I was thinking about this last night. I was hesitant to speak, sort of like you, Bob. You said, you have privy to this email, and there's, in some ways, I know a lot more, and in some ways, I know a lot less than all of you in the scholarly realm. But I was thinking about what you were saying about the tide of physics and science, and Alex's and my first date was, he asked me to the physics film festival.
There is such a thing.
And one of the films that we saw, and they used, I don't know if they still do, they used to show this at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Powers of 10, where you zoom way, 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 way in, and you zoom way, 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 way out. And I mean, that was in 1973, before Alex ever thought of becoming a theologian, but I think that's what he did with his life. In physics, he told me from the first time we met what he wanted. He was getting ready to apply for graduate school in biophysics, and he said, what I want, really the question I have is, what is life? So he approached it from that physics of zooming in, and he was very dissatisfied with what he didn't find out. So then what to do? Go the other way. And he really didn't like reductionism. You probably know that. So I don't know if he found the meaning of life, but I just wanted to.
A great story.
I'm a doctoral student at the Graduate Theological Union, and I had a couple classes with Alex. He was not my advisor, but I want to contribute something related to his pedagogy, because I think that also kind of demonstrates this interest he had in using gesture over words. Okay, that's one thing. And also how he kind of dismantled boundaries in his teaching. I took a liturgical aesthetics class, and one of the things we did right at the beginning is we walked in the classroom, and we really did. I mean, this was not the first class, but he had, some wine and some grapes and those symbols, those recognizable symbols, and he just started pouring a glass of wine and handing it to each of us, and breaking the bread and passing it around. It was very powerful, and that's all. There were no words or anything. So those are the kinds of things he did in the classroom. The other thing is that at the GTU or GST, he was always teaching someone else. He was teaching justice.
Bill O'Neill,
He was teaching
Shergi with liturgy,
liturgy.
Mia, art.
Ron Nakasone.
Ron Nakasone,
Right.
Buddhist aesthetics, or aesthetics.
Interfaith.
Interfaith aesthetics. So he actually embodied that by presenting his thinking, jointly, and in a very humble way. It was always wonderful to see how they worked together. I was taking liturgy with Shergi and Alex, and he also sat in systematics and art and religion as a core doctoral faculty, you know. So that in itself was another way that he was crossing boundaries. So these are just some examples of the way he acted out what he believed.
Just a small observation. When I was watching the film this morning at Mass, I couldn't help but think of the movie Tree of Life that came out earlier this year, and I'd love to hear if Alex saw this movie and what he thought about it. Because in so many ways, I think it really embodies what you're talking about here in terms of focusing in and then focusing back out. And the movie is just so beautiful because it's really a work of art. There are moments that so little is said in the movie. There are minutes upon minutes of just listening to this amazing musical score throughout the movie. And after I saw this movie, this is the only movie this has ever happened, but as I'm watching the credits, the movie is over. I feel this wave upon a wave of the profundity of the movie overcome me, where I'm just simply speechless. And my wife had the same thing happen to her. We watched the credits, we began crying at the credits, and crying more as the credits were rolling, and listening to the music. And I realized that it was just this experience of just being silenced and in awe. And that's the power of the movie. And I think in so many ways, Alex is trying to get at that sense, focusing in on the little stories, on the minutia of life, but then having the courage to pull back, to pan out, and to ask these really large questions about world, universe, cosmos, which I think the movie does as well. And it's really that experience of just being in the presence of that profundity in silence or listening to the music that can be so powerful. So I would have loved to have a conversation with Alex about that movie.
I just, you know, when I finished seeing that movie, I turned to my husband and I said, this director read Garden of God. I mean, I do want to find out and I do want to check this because I heard Alex in so many spots in that film. The approach to it, but also almost textually, there was like little quotes here and there, and I said, he has to have read Garden of God.
He also translated Heidegger, this guy, Malin, the director. I mean, he's actually, I mean, this idea of looking at what's in front of you is actually something he studied in phenomenology.
He's pretty amazing, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to share one of my visits to Catherine and Alex's home. I was in such a hurry to go see Alex that I literally ran to the front door, walking through the front garden, and I didn't even see the garden. And I go in, and I say hello to Alex, and we're chatting, and all of a sudden this question of his garden comes up. I go, what garden? He goes, the garden in the front yard. And I said, I didn't even see it. I was in such a hurry, like this. I was just like focused, getting to the front door. And then Catherine and Alex walked me out, and they showed me this beautiful garden. And things that normally maybe don't sit together. And all the colors that you normally maybe wouldn't arrange are all beautifully arranged. And this beautiful garden is feeding the neighborhood. There's wonderful strawberries that fall on the sidewalks, and the children come by and help themselves. And there are birds, and there's plants that you use for your kitchen, and all these wonderful things. And Alex and Catherine are just opening up this garden to me, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is like the garden of God that is surrounding us, embracing us, and we don't even know. And then we go in, and towards some of the final days when Alex, you move him into the dining room, it always struck me. It's by the window, and you had this beautiful hanging glass mosaic with flowers, and he could hear the birds from outside. And it's like these spaces just open. There's no separation of wall to garden. The garden is inside the house. And on the little table is San Martin de Porres, his good friend, with all the little creatures. And the way that little statue was, the way San Martin was angled he would look at Alex, and Alex would look at him. I mean, it was just really, I got this feeling that there were no more, whatever spaces separated people, whatever boundaries separate us from who knows what, it wasn't there. And it struck me even toward the first last few days, how gifts were coming to Alex from cosmic, from all over the world. People were embracing him and loving him. But also, the one day he was looking for a little image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and it couldn't be found, and they were looking for it, and all of a sudden it falls out from the bookcase, and there's this beautiful, large image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I mean, it's like all of creation was in harmony. And, you know, so what's in the book, I don't know, for me, was kind of embodied in how he was celebrating and living life. This is very embodied.
Going back to your comments on pedagogy, I think too for him the boundaries of the pastoral and the academic didn't exist. I mean, I think he bringing up his popular writings, the fact that he had Nancy and I participate in the planning of the Good Friday at the church, and that for him was part of our PhD education.
He required it.
You know, and that he would take me to the Bible study group he had at the church, and that he really, and again, it was part of my doctorate. It was part of what he wanted me. It was part of how he mentored me. And never saying it explicitly, but in retrospect, thinking about all those things that are such a part of who I am now, or try to be, I should say, as a professor and as a teacher, but that he really, he was teaching. I mean, you know, and it was just as valuable as you know, more valuable than some of the seminars we had to sit through at the GTU, and that for him, that we talk about it a lot in our work, but he embodied it, not only in him and his research and his writing, but in his teaching and mentoring as well.
I think he lived kind of that sacramental imagination of what you're describing, and including us in that. And I remember too, like the first time I went to San Leandro, and there's this beautiful sacred canopy that covers the whole sanctuary area. And he made mention of that. It's, you know, here you see this sacred canopy that really frames and shapes the space that we're in here and signals the cosmos and what's beyond. And so I think that all of that was really very much a part of the imagination that he brought to it. Yeah, I completely concur that it was very much a part of my education to be with him and with you in the church, and planning all these liturgies, planning Guadalupe, planning Good Friday. It was really.
Who had the idea of the mannequin?
I think someone did, yeah. Someone gave it.
Oh,
yeah.
I've got
yeah.
I remember Alejandro, and when we come to San Fernando, when Virgil and I were doing that study, just some of the things he said. Well, he called, I don't know if it was him or Virgil, but they fed off each other very creatively. He called San Fernando and played the liturgy. He said it's sacred chaos. It's all this messiness. I remember one thing he said, I quoted him on it a couple of times. He had observed these old guys in suits, and you could tell they were working class. But you know, you guys saw the big fat way they make the ties kind of twisted, you know. You can't tell they have more than this tie too much, but you got to check your ties every once. But he saw these guys, you know, and his words was, that's subversive hospitality, because ostensibly they're welcoming everyone into the church and handing out the booklets and everything. He said, but these are the people who during the week, you know, are so put down. They're laborers. Rodriguez, get over here, pick this up, you know. But here, they're the masters of the house. They're welcoming the mayor and the other people who are coming. He says, so it's subversive hospitality. By saying welcome and we're glad you're here, they're also saying, I am somebody, you know, in their own kind of way that they never would say out of humility. So he went on and talked about how this was subversive hospitality. That ability to notice, and that's the thing that I've said before, that I'm hearing even undercutting this conversation in the stories and in the intellectual comments that are being made. You know, this ability to see something very simple, a person handing out a missalette, but then noticing what is really going on there, what kind of relational, human exchanges are taking place, and what it means, and what it has the possibility of meaning. You know. I guess if I had a prayer for all of us, who, you know, be for my own self in teaching, how do you take a group of 50 undergraduates and have them leave the class really inspired someday? They saw something they didn't see before that was deeply there. I think that's what it means to be a theologian at the end, to see the invisible, invisible. To use another set of Alex's favorite words, they can see the visible, but how do you help to see the invisible that's there, that's permeating, that's screaming out, you know, grace and presence of God.
I wanted just to add one more of the Christmas stories, since you gave us that wonderful weaving, and that's the one in Community of the Beautiful when he talks about what happened at the church and the upstairs and downstairs and the separation, and I think all of these themes are through that story. You know, the downstairs church proper with the large perfect tree with the white Christmas, and then the upstairs little meeting room, I guess it was, where the Hispanic community was, that's where they could worship. And they had this little tiny artificial tree laden with tons of colored lights and worldly things, right? I mean, that's how he describes it. And how he notices is just amazing, you know, separation and what I end up calling an anti-Christmas tree downstairs, because the community upstairs ends up having to leave that parish. But for me, the most interesting thing about that is that Frank Birch Brown takes that story in his book, Good Taste, Bad Taste, Christian Taste, and he takes Alex's story and he really doesn't get it. And he's working also in aesthetics, but as an Anglo, and he says that as an Anglo-Protestant. And he has difficulty with this whole messiness idea and everything. And he just recently wrote me a note saying, looking at that now, Frank Birch Brown, he knows he would really see it differently. So Alex made an impact through his ongoing relationship with Frank. So that what eluded Frank so much when he wrote that critique in his book, now he really has a different perspective on it. So I think it may take a while, you know, for people to begin to really get Alex, but I think it has begun. I think it really has. And for me, that note from Frank Birch Brown meant a lot.
All right, being cognizant of our bodies in this space, I'm feeling like we're ready to stretch and move and maybe share stories in smaller space. So I'm breaking for lunch. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you to